jumping in, we just talked about advisory firms, and I'm kind of jumping out of order of what we were going to talk about, but knowing we're coming into proxy season soon, and we'll all be part of drafting of proxies, do y'all believe it's advisable, it's in your best interest, it's beneficial, it's whatever, to pay for ISS advisory services, as we've all done, and I call blood money, but as we've all done, and most of us have done in the past, do you see a benefit to it? I'll tell you one thing, I'm working with the board right now, is working with Paul, and they also did undertake the ISS advisory service. They said they've learned more from Paul in the last week than they did for all that they paid to ISS. So that was also a plug of how good you are. Okay.
Well, either that or they didn't know much before they.
I don't think that's it. Okay, so thoughts on retaining those services?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll start because I'm the guy that once they've done it, I've then got to go out and get the vote. I think there's sometimes just this knee jerk that you've got to go out and get the ISS. You've got to run it through the model. And by the way, they don't do it on everything, right? They just do it on compensation. We're working on an M&A deal that's not yet public, and the CEO asked me, well, can we go and have ISS? Can we run this deal through ISS? They didn't understand that ISS doesn't sort of preview M&A deals. They don't preview votes on directors. Just really is kind of this comp plan. You really first have to look at, is ISS going to make a difference? And is it worth paying $40,000 to have ISS run this model if they're only going to move 5% of the vote, and we've got all these big shareholders that are going to make a decision on their own? That's where the battlefront is. So I think before you do that, you should do it. But there are companies where you've got a very passive, quant-driven shareholder base. ISS is going to be outcome determinative, and I grit my teeth when I tell companies to do this, or tell them, don't tell them not to. But sometimes you sort of have to run. Now sometimes you can take your chances. You can get out there, and if you have to, you can amend the proxy once the report comes out. If you think you have to, so because ultimately shareholders may may support you otherwise. I think it's very case specific, and it shouldn't just be the knee jerk that you go. There are some of your comp consultants that have sort of the quasi-ISS model as well that they do as part of it. So talk to them as well.
I would say a couple of facts about this consulting business. It's supposed to be a Chinese wall between the two sides. There is literally a locked door between where ICS sits and where the research team sits.
There's a door.
There is a door. There are very, very few people on the consulting, the advisory side who have ever worked in research, so they don't actually know how to do the analysis. They've read the policy, but you could read the policy. Paul probably knows the policy better than a lot of them. The other thing is, if you, as a company, hire ICS as advisors on something, you are forbidden from telling the research team that you hired them, and they're forbidden from telling the research team we're advising. So you're kind of left with the question, what is it we're actually buying? And that is the question you should be asking. There's not a lot of insight there. They do, by the way, they have a, remember Edelvina? A woman I fired, 12 years ago from the Proxy Fights team. They hired her back a couple years ago to do a new consulting gig where companies that were going to be in a proxy fight, she would write up for them how ISS was going to recommend. I know this because I got to read one of them from a client who was asking, well, should we subscribe to this service and get more from her? Most people who read a newspaper can tell you how the facts are going to play out. What matters more is what's your strategy for how you're going to tell the narrative, how you're going to fend off this and open up this. It's all that kind of stuff matters. With compensation and other stuff, the strategy has to happen before you put your proxy statement out, but there are far more insightful people working at a number of different advisory firms than ISS. I would say, you got money to burn, go ahead, but you're not going to get value out of it is fundamentally the thing. So in our group, we have Kim Castellino, who was the head of U.S. research for ISS for about 10 years. He also created and implemented the compensation analyses. He's really good at going through that stuff. He is not the only one. Paul's team has people who may or may not have the ISS imprimatur, but they've done it enough times to know it. There are law firms that have this kind of expertise as well. The only thing you're buying is a false sense of confidence that these people speak for ISS, and what they say will bind the research team, and it just will not happen.
My advice on this is to get good advice. From Paul or Chris, I think a lot of boards, especially younger board members, troubled companies, the knee-jerk reaction is to engage. To what is the position of ISS? What is the position of Glass Lewis? How can we pay the money to try to secure a more favorable outcome? That's not always the answer. And I think you get some veterans, you ask them the question, and they've got very good instincts about this is money worth spending or it's money not worth spending.
Yep.
And I think we're going to talk some more later in compensation and other things about interactions with the advisory firms generally, but I think I'll leave it there.
Let's
I'll say one of my nightmares was when Chris was at ISS.
Told you it goes back a ways. You think you have the long knives out.
No, actually, that wasn't my nightmare. My nightmare was having a client who had hired ISS for the consulting, and then the ISS consulting people, an activist came in, and they started talking to the ISS consulting people about how Chris was going to look at they knew absolutely nothing. But because they were ISS, they took it as gospel that they had the inside knowledge of how Chris was going to look at it. Meanwhile, I'd sat in front of Chris 30 times, watching him grill boards and management teams, what he's going to ask for, what's important, reading the analyses on things like that. So that's while it's not, you can't pay them for the consulting on a proxy contest or an M&A deal, they still try to find a way in on that. So I would just be careful.